This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, let's start again. I'm very pleased to introduce Papathomas. He has a background in electrical engineering and computer science. It's much better than having a background in psychology. He was a member of the research staff in the Visual Perception Research Department, headed by Bella Ulesh at Bell Labs, which is a sort of heaven for cognitive psychologists, and I'm deeply jealous of him for having been there. But he's now professor at Rutgers in the Department of Biomedical Engineering in the Laboratory of Visual Research. He studies the role of visual attributes, that is colour, lumen and shape, spatial frequency and so on in perception. And he's designed several exhibitions in science museums, and his work has been exhibited at the New York Arts Biennial. And he's going to tell us about masks and reverse perspectives.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. I would like to, before I forget, I would like to thank the organizers, Barry, Colin, Ophelia, Sharar, and others whom I have not met, but they work behind the scenes, to Patrick Hughes for awakening the artist in me, to Di Atkinson and Patrick for their friendship, and to the late Bela Ulesh that you mentioned for making a psychologist out of the hardware/software designer of microprocessors, microprocessor-based systems. Here's an outline of my talk. I will concentrate mostly on illusions in which the depth you perceive is the opposite of the physical depth in the stimulus. So that's the general theme of my talk today. But it has a sub-theme, and that is the role of top-down influences and prior knowledge and prior experiences, suggestions by others and so on in perception. So, of course, we can talk about generally about top-down influences, and if we think of the visual system as being cognitively impenetrable, nevertheless it has its own executive. The visual system itself, even though it's cognitively impenetrable, it has its own executive, and it definitely recognizes faces. The moment you open your eyes and you see a face, you recognize that there is a face out there. Imagine cameras have a face recognition, not recognition, face detection system. Nowadays cameras, we are too old, some of us, and we remember that cameras 10 years ago did not have a face recognition system. So now they have smarts, just like we do. And we imbue them with that smart. So they have some top-down recognition systems and top-down detection systems, because they draw a rectangle around faces. And of course, cameras will become more and more sophisticated, just like our brains are more sophisticated. I just wanted to explain to you what I mean by top-down. That's exactly the kind of top-down I mean. It's cognitively impenetrable, yet it allows us to interpret the world differently depending on what the prior experiences we have. So what comes through, what we perceive in the end is not only what comes through our eyes, but it's also how we interpret it. So in that sense, I'm repeating Richard Gregory's hypothesis that the visual brain is nothing more than a hypothesis-making and testing engine. So in that sense, we do make hypotheses. So you can catch the visual executive compromised, and you can see indeed that top-down influences are there. For example, if people have much alcohol or cannabis, or they're sleep deprived, they see some illusions that I'm going to talk about today less often and less strongly than controls that don't have these compromises in the visual executive. Also, if you are in a hypnopompic state or in a hypnagogic state, just before going to sleep and just after waking up, you tend to misinterpret what you see, and you tend to see a pile of papers, for example, for your cat, which has happened and it's documented in the book. The other example that I would like to talk about, where is evidence of top-down influences, is pathologies, and I'll talk about such a pathology, schizophrenia in particular. And finally, when you impoverish stimuli themselves, when you impoverish stimuli such as the Dalmatian dog or the Dallenbach cow, people find themselves, catch themselves making hypotheses as to what they're seeing and then testing their hypothesis vis-a-vis the data that are coming through the eyes. And only when the two of them are in agreement do we come up with a definite person. So, and of course, finally, another example where top-down influences are visible is the illusions that I'm going to talk about today. So that was a preamble to my talk, talking about top-down influences in general, but now let me go to these kinds of illusions in particular. So the problem is, how do we perceive the world as stable when we move about, like I'm moving now? Why isn't that chair moving in my mind? Because it definitely moves in the optic flow on my retina. And of course we have a lifetime worth of experiences, plus we have the evolution behind us, and it tells us that the world is stable. And so when I ask my mother, when she asks me what I do, and I tell her, well, this is one of the things I do, she says, wait a minute, that's of course the chair will not move on you. Of course the bottle and a friend of yours will not move if they don't move. You move, and that's how you know that the things out there are stable. But then it's exactly at that point when you need some stimuli to bring home the question of why it is an interesting question. And the stimuli that I'm going to talk about today, most of you are familiar with them, but that begs the question of how we can recover stability in the outside world as we move about. And of course there are stimuli that defy this, our ability to do that for 99.999% of the stimuli. So as I said, I will talk about bottom-up and top-down processes, and then I'll offer some converging evidence for top-down processes. In particular, for these kinds of stimuli, the inversion effect, which we studied both with the hollow mask, as Hill and Bruce did back in 1993 and 1994, and also we studied it with Hughes reverspectives, and we'll talk about pathologies, both with the Hughes reverspectives and the hollow mask, and also we've done an experiment where we studied when you see these stimuli, what happens to divergent side movements. I think my pointer is dying, but I have a low-tech. What happens to divergent side movements when you see such stimuli? And then, of course, there's computational evidence that I'll share with you that computer vision algorithms suffer from the same illusions. Then I'll offer one possible inferential solution. I'm not claiming that this is the way things work, but this is just an explanation that at least can get us to think about these issues. That explanation goes a long way for explaining the motion that you saw yesterday in the unveiling of Patrick Hughes' reverspective. While you move, it moves with you, or why hollow mask moves as you move in front of it. It also explains why, when you have a stereogram in front of you with red-green glasses or with polarized glasses, and you move in front of it, the square that sticks in front, if such a representation is there on the stereogram, appears to be moving laterally with you. It also explains why sometimes when you have a flat painting of a perspective drawing and you move in front of it, it appears to be moving with you. And also why faces that are facing you and you move about, they constantly gaze at you. And finally, I would like to pay tribute to a new genre of reverspectives that Patrick Hughes has come up with. He has painted 5 such reverse perspectives, but I don't think they're appreciated as much as they ought to be appreciated. Maybe they don't have as high value for connoisseurs of stereograms, of reverse perspectives, and collectors of reverse perspectives. But if they knew what goes on in there, I think that they would pay dear money to acquire such a painting. And finally, of course, I'll finish with conclusions. Let me set my timer. We have 50 minutes, right? And 5 minutes are gone. Thank you, Colin. So let's start going through this outline. So first of all, the problem. So as I said, the retinal image, and I know Patrick vehemently opposes this phrase, because there is no such thing as a retinal image. I'm only using it as a phrase, and you know what I'm talking about. This is the optic flow that impinges on our photoreceptors. It's not the retinal image. But that, whatever we want to call it, changes constantly as we move about in the environment. And then, as I said before, the issue is how do we achieve 3D shape invariance under self-motion. So that's the problem. And of course, the problem, if you want to point out the problem to someone who is not sophisticated in vision, you have to show them this stimuli. So let me show you quickly a perspective, because you saw one yesterday. So here is a reverse perspective. It's drawn such that the two truncated pyramids on both sides of the central building are coming toward you. And if you look at it geometrically, this is the front view. If you look at it from the top, those things jut out. This thing and that thing jut out. And if you look at it from the side, of course, this juts out from the wall. This is the wall, and the observer is out here, looking at this if you have a top view. And of course, the reverse perspectives, the bottom-up cues for depth, such as stereopsis, accommodation, lens accommodation, vergence eye movements, motion parallax, all of them tell you that these things are sticking up. They're very reliable cues to depth. Nevertheless, the perspective cues tell you that this thing is receding, the streets are receding into the distance. So there is a competition there between prior experiences and experience with perspective and signals that are coming through our eyes. So that's why I think that these stimuli are very important, because they show you the interaction of those two factors, the top-down and the bottom-up. I would like to also share something with you that some of you may not be familiar with. If you look at this surface, three-dimensional surface, unpainted, before Patrick Hughes puts his magic on, it will still be moving. You'll still see the illusion, because, again, this edge is smaller, but it's closer to you than that edge. And if you take any pair of edges, the one that's closer to you is smaller than the one that's further away from you. And we're not used to seeing that. We're used to seeing things in perspective. And that's why you get fooled. Of course, one can play games and make a forced perspective, like this. Here in the forced perspective, the scenery goes in. So rather than having things that are jutting out from the wall, remember this is the wall, here you have things that are going in congruency with the monocular cues and the binocular cues, in congruency with the bottom-up signals. So this is why it's called forced perspective, and this is used in theaters, where if you want to show a room in a theater stage, you show the right wall receding in that direction, the left wall receding in this direction, the ceiling is stooping down away from the audience, and the stage, the floor, comes toward the audience in many theaters. That way they give you the percept of depth. And that's why I call it forced perspective, and sometimes I also call it proper perspective, because this is reverse perspective. But remember, here the bottom-up signals and the perspective signals are in agreement. Therefore, there's no ambiguity. And therefore, when you see such a stimulus and you move about, there's no reason for it to move, because you recover the true depth right away. The reason why you see this moving is because you see an inverted depth, and that gives rise to motion.
On the right-hand one, is there also a painted linear perspective, or is it simply derived from the true three-dimensionality? Is there a super perspective in a sense?
It is a super perspective.
It's a super perspective.
Right. It's a forced perspective.
Yeah.
Right. So I would like to show you some animation next. So I hope that this works well. So I have to suspend this one and show you first. So this is a perspective that I took the liberty to copy blatantly Patrick Hughes, and with his permission. and I call it Historia, that's my hometown, the homage to Patrick Hughes. So I will play it for you. Notice that I have shown you, I'm also showing you the pedestal, the turntable on which this is sitting. And as you see now, this is the proper perspective, the forced perspective. You see it moving in the proper direction, in the physical direction in which it rotates. But when you see the reverse perspective, now it's jutting out toward you. That's a classical Patrick Hughes perspective. It starts turning in the opposite direction. And actually, there's a torsional motion between it and the turntable. So that's the kind of illusion that I'm talking about, and of course, most of you are familiar with it. You've seen it many times. And again, the fact that when it turns around, you already know how it is constructed, you know its geometry, yet you can't help but fall for the illusion, speaks about some form of prior experiences playing a role in this perception. So the next stimulus I would like to show you is a mask using the same trick. I have this on YouTube, and you cannot imagine how many people curse me for playing computer tricks. That's why I had to put this disclaimer. There's no computer tricks here. Again, this is a bit different from Richard Gregory's mask because it's painted on both sides. So it's painted realistically on both sides. And it was very difficult to find an artist who understood what I wanted to do. But now I have a professional artist who does these things for me. So it's not a convex face. But again, our prior knowledge of faces being convex fools us into thinking that this was a mask and it rotates in the opposite direction. And again, to make the point one more time, we know exactly what is the geometry because we've seen it. And yet, when it turns around, most of us, some of us can be trained to resist the illusion, but it is not easy. You see it as a regular face that rotates in the opposite direction. Okay, and then finally I would like to show you one more member of this family of illusions, that we talked about yesterday, the Ames window. If I can only find my cursor. There it is. Sorry about that. Between the pointer and the cursor, I have a hard time. There we go. So this is a trapezoid fence done by Marcel de Heer, and it is a trapezoid that rotates 360 degrees continuously, yet most of you, I hope, will see it as oscillating back and forth. And that's again another one of those depth inversion illusions, because it being a trapezoid, when the short edge is toward us and the long edge is far away from us, instead of perceiving it the way it actually physically is, we reverse the depth and we place the long edge closer to us, even though it's physically farther away from us. So these are three stimuli of this type. So, here is the situation as best as I can show it schematically. The outside world, us moving from one place to another. So this is self-motion. So there's a sequence of retinotopic neural images, optic flow, that's mapped ultimately to the cortex. And the signals that are available to recover the fact that this real object out there is stationary are visual bottom-up signals, such as the retinal flow, and proprioceptive eye movements and vestibular self-motion signals. There may be other signals, and I'm deliberately missing one, because I would like to work up to it. Now, Gibson's direct direct perception theory posits that extraretinal signals are not necessary to recover the 3D shape of objects. But the challenge is how can we explain certain percepts with three-dimensional objects? And of course he would argue that this is a made-up stimulus that has no significance. Nevertheless, it would be nice to explain why does it work and why do we have these illusions. So the bottom-up, the kind of bottom-up signals I'm talking about are stereopsis due to the presence of two eyes, motion parallax, color, eye divergence, lens accommodation, exogenous attention. If something figures out there, it captures my attention immediately, and it's data-driven, and other kinds of data-driven influences. And by schema-driven, I mean prior experience, store knowledge as a store knowledge of faces in a camera, as I said before, expectations, suggestions from others. And what I mean by suggestions from others is when you show someone the Dalaba cow, they can spend hours there without being able to tell what they're looking at. But if you start giving them hints one by one, ultimately they will see the stimulus. Now, context, and of course endogenous attention. If somebody tells you that you are looking at a farm animal, it will take you less time, I presume, and I don't have evidence for it, but I presume that it will take you less time than if you don't know. And of course there are also what Richard Gregory talked about, sideways influences such as shading, perspective perhaps, what Adelson calls atmosphere, what Gilchrist calls anchoring, that the lighter hue in anywhere appears to be white, attention, and so on. Now, the motion parallax, I would like to spend some time in the motion parallax because it will go a long way toward explaining, at least providing one explanation for why Patrick Hughes' reverse perspectives and the face and the mask works. So here's my eye, time t equals 1, and here are two stimuli out there. A is further away than B, and they cast they excite the photoreceptors on the retina. And then I will move my eye to a new location. Let's say I'll look straight ahead to make the argument simpler. And of course, I'm going to show again the site of the photoreceptors that were excited before as B1 and A1 just for reference. And then now, however, point A will excite another neighborhood of photoreceptors, and point B will excite another neighborhood of photoreceptors. And of course, in the process, there will be motion parallax signals, and by motion parallax, one way to explain it, one way to describe it is the distance from B1 to B2, the arc that point B, this is not mine, okay, the arc that point B travels on the retina, and then the arc that point A travels on the retina. And as you see here, the motion parallax for point A is smaller than the motion parallax for point B, therefore we infer that point B is closer, right?
Can I just ask you one thing? You've expressed this as two discrete views, if you like. But what actually happened, I had to according to Gibson, there's a mathematics of this continuous transformation.
Indeed.
And that specifies.
But nevertheless, the two endpoints define the arc, and one arc is larger than the other. And let's leave it at that because I think I'm oversimplifying because I have little time. But nevertheless, you're right. In the long run, we should look at the arcs and their shapes. But the fact that one is longer than the other, we can say that the point B having a larger arc is closer than point A, and of course that happens when you're in a train, and then it moves fast. Near trees move much faster over our retina than far trees. But you have to be very careful. This is not like stereo. If this were stereo, and these are 2 points, and these are left eye and right eye, problem solved. Because you have one point has one disparity, the other point has another disparity, and you can easily tell which one is closer and further, because both eyes are open at the same time, and they get a snapshot of the world at the same time. However, with motion, you have to be careful, because it takes time to go from here to here. And there are two possibilities. One of them, maybe point B moves, such as B may not be here, it may be out there at time t equal 1 when my eye is here, and at time equal 2, when my eye is there, this point has moved over there. So now what happens is that point B still casts the same, still excites the same retinal neighborhoods, but it is farther away than A. Even though its retinal, even though its motion parallax is larger. So motion can play games on you. So that's one not one interpretation, one reality. There's another reality. Another reality is that point B is fixed in space, just like before. But somehow, by a certain Patrick Hughes playing games on us, we don't assign the correct depth to it. We assign the depth out there instead of assigning the depth right there where it is physically. Because, as we know, any point that's impinging on our retina can be anywhere along the line of sight. Okay, so imagine that this point now has been assigned there by accident. And as I move from here to here, I don't discover that this point indeed is closer to me. I still get the illusion that this point is out there, and I move over here. And now, of course, instead of perceiving point B to be stationary and closer to me than point A, I see further, and I get the illusion of it moving. So there are these two possibilities. That summarizes what I said, okay? So I'll come back to this. So the third item that I was going to talk about is converging evidence. And first of all, I would like to talk about the stimulus inversion. Take a stimulus and turn it upside down. And that has been done already by Hill and Bruce in 1993, 1994, where they also worked not only with the human face and its upside down version, but also with the hollow potato. And they established that the hollow potato was as strong in producing an illusion, in other words, being perceived as a regular potato, as the inverted human face. So as far as humans are concerned, an inverted human face is just as good as a potato. So the idea is that when you invert the human face, we're not used to inverted human faces. Most of the time we spend looking at people upright. And therefore, we have less top-down influence to bear on the mask, and that's why we have a reduced illusion. So that's the rationale. Because the stereo cues, the distribution of stereo cues, motion parallax cues, texture gradient, perspectives, foreshortening, all that is the same whether I see it upright or upside down. So any difference in performance must be attributable to schema-driven processes. And here's another of Patrick's paintings, openings from 1998. Here is the mask that you saw earlier, upright and upside down. And here are the data. We ran this experiment with both monocular viewing and binocular viewing. And here's the face, and it's inverted. So upright, up arrow means upright, down arrow means inverted. Here's the scene, upright and inverted, monocularly. And here's the face again, upright, inverted. The scene, upright and inverted. Of course, what I'm plotting is how much time people spent not seeing the illusion. So the illusion is stronger the smaller the bar. And as you see, the illusion is much stronger for upright vis-a-vis upside down faces, both for monocular and binocular viewing. And the same trend is true of reverspectives, but it does not achieve statistical significance. And of course, you reason that, well, the perspective is present whether you have this upright or upside down, and that's why maybe faces are quite special. And you also did this with approaching and retreating from the stimulus and finding out at what distance the illusion breaks down, exactly the same results. Pathologies. We tried for the first time the hypothesis that people with schizophrenia apply less top-down influences and therefore see the illusion less strongly or much more weakly than controls of the same age, gender, educational background, and so on and so forth, has been tested with masks, and indeed that's an established result. But nobody had tried reverse perspectives, and so this is an experiment. Again, this is a very busy slide, and I apologize for not having the time to do it better for you. But please concentrate on this panel. This is motion parallax. The viewing here is patched eye, and they go left and right until they hit a block, so they have 20 centimeters to go left and right, which means more signal, more monocular signal, motion signal, than stereopsis, because they have much more parallax, motion parallax. So this is to monocular so as to knock down stereopsis. This is the opposite. This is with a chin rest and both eyes open to knock down motion parallax and only enable stereopsis. So this is motion parallax and this is stereo. As you see, stereo is, again, I'm plotting the proportion of not seeing the illusion. So the illusion is stronger the smaller the bars. And as you see, generally, the stereo system is better than the motion system for the reason I showed you earlier. Motion is ambiguous. Also, if you notice that these are the controls in blue and these are the patients in green, it is statistically significant that the patients are seeing the illusion less strongly than the controls. This is a catch stimulus of a convex mask to make sure that people are reporting what they ought to be reporting. So these are overall the results, that the illusion is weaker for patients. The effect is valid for stereo and for monocular viewing. The effect, by the way, these are the reverspectives, and these are the faces. This is the catch trial with the face. But again, this is unpainted reverse perspective, just the surface, white, and this is the painted reverspective with the cues that you saw earlier. As you see, both for monocular viewing and for binocular viewing, the illusion is much stronger when it is painted. Texture means painted. That's what we mean by texture. And then, of course, as you see, reverse perspectives are there's nothing special about faces and people with schizophrenia. They get the same decrease in illusion with stimuli such as scenery. And then finally, look at now, please ignore the top panel now that I tried my best to explain it, and look at the bottom panel. What you're seeing here are the results for patients only. These are 30 patients, 10 from each category. And the severity of the patients increases as you go from the severity increases as you go from outpatients here in blue to extended here in green and to acute here, acute. So these are days since the last admission to the hospital. So this is severity goes to the left, and this is the proportion again how often they did not see the illusion. And as you see, the people with severe case of schizophrenia do not see the illusion much more than people with mild cases of schizophrenia. Not only that, look how nicely segregated or clustered the acute cases, the extended or middle severity, and the not so severe cases are here, vis-a-vis another measure here that is obtained by a questionnaire, by asking the patients. Not only that, but the correlation coefficient is better for our measure than it is for the questionnaire that qualified health professional conducts with the patients. Also, I would like, so all of this is our paper that just came out in the Journal of Clinical Psychology, and in fact, there is another paper by Daima and others in 2009 who obtained fMRI evidence using dynamic programming that there are less signals coming from the higher brain areas toward lower brain areas in people with schizophrenia than with controls. So that's the pathology argument. And then we showed reverse perspectives to subjects, and we asked them to use vergence eye movements to see different points on the stimuli. So again, this is the same stimulus that I showed you earlier. And if you notice, these points, they go one. This is closest to you. Remember, this is the opposite of what you think. This is a reverse perspective. So that point one is right there. The observer, this is the wall. The observer is in this direction. So one is closest to you, 2 is next closer, 3 and 4 are closer, 4 and 5 are at the same distance, and 6 is as far away as possible. So they go in ascending distance from the observer. Okay, so remember that. And here are the results of the divergence eye movements. First, we ask them to try to see the illusion, and when they see the illusion, they get this characteristic of divergence eye angle, which we translate to fixation distance from the observer. Look, as I said before, points 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are going in ascending distance from the viewer. And that's exactly what happens when they don't see the illusion. This is the same stimulus, but when they do see the illusion, the point that's closer appears to be farther, and they fixate farther. The point that's farther physically is actually it appears to be closer, and they fixate closer. So their divergence eye movements are governed by the illusion, not by the physical geometry. However, there are results by the laboratory of Anne in the Netherlands who show that for fast eye movements, they follow the geometry, they follow the physical geometry. So there may be two visual systems, two eye motion systems, one that's automatic and it follows the geometry, it follows the cues that it gets from the cues to depth, early bottom-up cues to depth, and then there's another one, slow, deliberate system, because what you see here results from very stable 4 seconds and more stable fixations. So this is the end of that. As I try to go very fast so that we can cover the material as best as I can, but I should have said in the beginning, if you have any questions, please stop me, because I don't want this to be a monologue that I lose some people in the audience. Computational evidence. Now, I have a colleague at Rutgers who has developed an algorithm for tracking facial features. So you have a face either moving or laughing or turning, and the algorithm tries to build a 3-dimensional model of that 2-dimensional animation sequence, and then update it as both from animation data and also from shadows and all other kinds of cues. So he has something like 300 polygons to accurately represent the face, and the main message here, because we can go into a lot of length, but the main key idea is that the 3-dimensional assumption that this algorithm has is that faces are convex. So that's a built-in assumption into the program. The moment they see a face and recognize a face, they automatically assume that this face is with the nose sticking out and everything else that a convex face looks like. And of course, guess what happens? This is how we rotated. I showed this program the same thing I showed you, but without the base, just the face, rotating 360 degrees. So this is the face looking at us. This is a face rotated by 45 degrees, minus 90 degrees, sorry, minus 90 degrees, plus 90 degrees, minus 180 degrees. Sorry, I was right, 45 degrees. So 90 degrees is when it looks to the right, minus 90 to the left, plus 90 to the right. Okay, and then of course this is 135. Already we are seeing the hollow mask, and this is the hollow mask facing at us on both sides. And look what the algorithm does. So this is how we rotate the mask, let's say clockwise, going from here to here. And of course, when the face is convex, anywhere from here to here, from looking to the left all the way to looking to the right, and in between, they recover precisely the same motion. This slope is 1. So they recover the true orientation of the face. But when they see the hollow mask, we tend to clockwise, they tend counterclockwise. The slope is minus 1. So the computer algorithm suffers from the same illusion that we suffer. And I passed this by a veteran who has retired in computer vision. He says, this is the first algorithm that I know that suffers from visual illusion. And so it's expectedly, this is expectedly so, but also look at this gap here. This is where there is self-occlusion of the mask. It's not fully visible. And therefore, the program cannot make heads or tails of what it sees. It's not a face anymore. So this is not proof or It is simply some kind of some sort of an existence proof that here's a program that has this built-in knowledge that faces are convex, and when it sees this stimulus, it gets full just like humans. And of course, as you expect, when you imbue it with an assumption that the top-down schema now allows the program to assume that this can be either a convex or a concave phase. So you remove the stipulation that the phase is convex, and now, of course, the phase can be. The program has enough signals. It had enough signals back here too. There's enough motion parallax signals to overcome this stipulation and recover the true geometry. But the weight that they gave, after all, this was the only geometry that they allowed, phases being convex, and therefore the algorithm could not have used the low-level signals, the bottom-up signals. But when it is allowed to use bottom-up signals, because it can interpret the phase any which way it likes, based on its bottom-up signals, it recovers the fact that this is a thin mask, facial mask, that rotates 360 degrees. So again, this is an existence proof. So let me offer a possible inferential solution, what I call a projected out 3D representation, and I think that's what you were alluding to earlier, that was missing. What I mean by that is, again, the same figure as before, but in addition to those signals that we have, the optical signal and the self-motion signal, either because of proprioceptive eye movements or vestibular systems, I believe that we also have another signal, which is the moment we open our eyes, we build a physical representation of what's out there. We build a three-dimensional geometry of everything that we see out there the moment we open our eyes. And when I first tried to pass this idea to my colleagues, people were skeptical because they said, well, that means that we need another layer of mechanisms to recover this and to produce a three-dimensional representation in our mind. However, we do that all the time. I mean, this is not necessary. It's not necessary to have a different representation. That's what we do all the time. We see the world out there. We project the world out there. That's natural. That's what we do at every waking moment of our lives. So it's a projected out signal, and we're simply not consciously of it. So let me now come to the illusions. So you'll see always in red the appearance, and in black the reality. So that's for the three next figures. I'll show you. I'll use the same convention. So again, this is not a retinal image. This is a neighborhood of retina which is excited by any of these quadrilaterals. Any of these quadrilaterals could have produced this excitation on the back of the retina, as long as the lines of sight are obeyed. The constraint of the lines of sight is obeyed, right? As long as the lines of sight are aligned, then any of these quadrilaterals could have produced that activation on the back of the retina. And how, of course, life is not, I mean, our eyes are not static, and we don't have only one eye. Our eyes move, and we have two eyes, therefore the right solution would have jumped out right away. So this is a very contrived way of explaining how we produce the right solution, but ultimately we come up with the most likely stimulus using some Bayesian calculations, among other things, and also triangulation using the two eyes. But again, let me go back to motion parallax. Here's a case where there's a signal out there, an object out there, a point, and I will move my eye from here to here. As long as I place this object in its physical location in my mind, as long as I recover the true depth, then as I move from here to here, there's no reason for this point to move. It stays stationary as it is. But what if, by some trick, the perceived distance is smaller than the actual distance from the object? In other words, somehow, by some trick, I see this point closer to me than it actually is. Then as I move from here to here, if I maintain this illusion of this point being closer to me than it actually is, I have no choice. Now I have a new line of sight, and I have no choice but to see that point moving with me. I move to the right, it moves to the right. And of course, the opposite happens when I misperceive the depth of this object and I place it beyond its physical location. In this case, this is where the point will be perceived, and as long as I maintain that illusion, as I move from here to the right, now this is the physical point, it does not move, therefore the line of sight will dictate that this point is there if I maintain this illusion of the point being further away. Now it will move further, in the opposite direction. So if the point is closer, it appears to be closer than it is, it will move with me. If it's farther away from me, it will move against me. And of course, it is the depth misalignment that produces this illusory motion. Again, this is my explanation, that's my theory, and I'm not suggesting that it is the right theory. It's just an attempt to explain why we see these things moving. Imagine that we have a proper perspective, a forced perspective. When you have a forced perspective, there is no reason for you to misrepresent the depth of all those points on the stimulus. And therefore, just like in the left case that I showed you earlier, when you move, I have to bring the pointer here. If you see the pointer, shout at me. Oh, here it is. There it is. Sorry about this. No. There we go. So if I move around, since I recover the true depth of every point, I'll see this as not moving. So that's a forced perspective, not moving. But if I have a reverse perspective, remember my notation, black is the physical stimulus, red is the perceived stimulus. These streets are jutting out toward me, but I see them as receding into the distance. This building is concave, but I see it as convex. Now, as you can see, the lines of sight are constrained by these anchor points. Every line of sight pivots around those anchor points, which are stationary. And therefore, when again, the physical stimuli are in front of the perceived stimuli, therefore, this thing should move away from me. I move to the right, it should move to the left. If I can only have a quick tap on my computer. There we go. There. Again, as I move about, this stimuli, these lines of sight will anchor around the physical points, and therefore, if I maintain illusion, I have no choice but to see moving. Or, the other choice is to recover the truth geometry, and then, of course, I don't see it moving. And that's exactly what happens when you go up close to it. You recover the true geometry, and as you move about, you don't see it moving. And we discussed this yesterday. Now, if we go now to the hollow mask, that's the opposite. Now, the physical stimulus is a hollow mask, let's say, which is fixed in space. And of course, any feature on that mask will be anywhere along the line of sight. And of course, if I see the illusion, this eye will appear here, that nostril will appear here, and so on and so forth, with every stimulus, every point on the stimulus. And of course, if I start moving, these points will be anchored, the lines of sight will be anchored along on the physical points, and if I maintain the illusion, obviously I will see the mask following me as it does in real life. And of course, the alternative is that by moving, the motion parallax signal breaks the illusion and I see no motion of the hollow mask. I see it as a hollow mask. But I don't have time to explain this, but you can use exactly the same geometry, and when you see a square in front, by designing your by constructing your lines of sight for a stereogram, when you move to the right, This shows that the vector moves to, the entire square, which is in front, moves to the right. And in fact, you can even find a formula for how much it moves, depending on the interocular distance and other. Also, it explains the following illusion for flat paintings. I was in Birmingham working with Zoe Kurzi on a proposal, and I was jogging one day, and this is not a real building. This is a flat billboard across the street. Now, my spy was killed because I was at least 30 feet away. So I was jogging, and I saw this building rotate with me. And as Patrick said about the boxes on top on the track surface, and here is my explanation again for it. This is the front view, and this is the top view. This is a flat surface. But what we perceive when we are at this location is this building here that comes toward us, because that's what the perspective cues tell us. And when I move from here to here, now this point in the middle of the building is fixed. Now I will see the building over here. As you see, the whole building will rotate with me. And I have an animation here. So that's the front view, that's the top view of the building, and that's what I perceive, and the building rotates with me. And in fact, this predicts also that the amount of rotation is less than if this were a reverse perspective. And I have the geometry, but we don't have time to go into this. So, now I would like to pay some tribute to Patrick Hughes for something that he has ingeniously devised. But before I do that, before I talk about Patrick Hughes, I would like to refresh our memory about reverse perspectives. Reverse perspectives have the opposite geometry of the painted reality. So they produce a very strong illusory motion because there are motion parallax signals that I didn't have a chance to point out to you. I forgot. Then you have a flat conventional perspective where the geometry is incongruent with the painted reality, because the geometry is a flat surface and the painted reality tells you that this is receding into the distance. So this is incongruent, and there's, as I said earlier, there's subtle illusory motion that you have to pay attention to, and also you have to see the stimulus by itself. If you see it in the presence of other background, this illusory motion is not very strong. So that's a very subtle illusory motion. And if it is a forced perspective, there's no reason to see motion because you recover the true geometry. So these are the three types of perspectives, at least three major types of perspectives based on the surface that they're painted on. And that's Hughes's, Patrick's baby. He discovered that. So here's his painting Forced into Reverse Perspective, 2008. This is what you see from the front, and this is the geometry. And it will take me a little time to explain it, but it's rather simple, and because it's so simple, it's ingenious. As you see here, there's a surface, a trapezoidal surface that comes this way, and another trapezoidal surface that comes that way. So these are shown there. But notice that one of the boxes is entirely drawn on that flat surface. So this is a flat conventional perspective. So is this. Do you see that? Now let's look at this box here, which is this box here. This box, look how ingeniously Patrick has drawn this zigzag line going up and down and up and down and up and down, and the other line that goes down and up, 180 degrees out of phase. But what does that do? Well, it makes reverse perspectives out of these boxes, and it makes proper perspectives out of these boxes at the same time. Because for this one, you see the geometry is an accordion surface, and this is farther away from the viewer than this. So the viewer is out here. So this is closer to the viewer, this is most distant from the viewer. So if you look at this edge here, we're talking about this box, if you look at this edge is longer than this edge for that box, but it's farther than this edge. Therefore, it's a reverse perspective. Whereas if you look at this box here, for example, this box over here, this one, now this one has this edge longer than this edge, but this edge is already closer than that edge, proper perspective. So you have flat, flat, reverse, 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 proper, 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 and reverse, 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 reverse. So what do you think will happen? If you move in front of it, the boxes that are in proper perspective or forced perspective will stay motionless because there's no reason for them to move. But the boxes that are here will move like crazy, they will follow you, And therefore, they will move differentially with respect to those boxes in the middle. So, what Patrick has done is he has been able to take the surfaces of this piece and break them by using objects. So this is the superiority of objects over surfaces. And the motion that you see is dictated by the objects, not by the surfaces. Suffice it to say that this surface entirely is also reverspective. You take any two edges on that surface, the one that's closer to you is shorter than the one that's further away from you. So this surface, unpainted, would give you the entire surface here, the entire accordion surface will go with you. Okay, the entire surface. But Patrick has painted it such that part of the surface will go with you and part of the surface will not move at all. Therefore, you see some torsional motion between these objects, and you'll see it in a moment. So I asked Patrick to make a movie of another painting like that, and you'll see for yourselves that this is indeed born by the experiment. Am I over time? Okay. So another thing I would like to tell you is that this edge here. Let's take this edge here. This edge is a single line. Here's a top view of that line, CD. Here's a side view of that line. So this is a single line. But look at this edge here. It appears to be closer to us here, farther, because this is a box that comes toward us, so this is set farther, and then again closer. So he takes a single line in space and he breaks it into lines that are closer and further away from us. So you tell me if this is not ingenious. Okay, so here is reverse perspective, as I said before, reverse perspective, forced perspective, and flat perspective. And unfortunately, so the unpainted surface itself is in reverse perspective. All three types of perspective are present on the same piece, and resulting objects dominate over surfaces and dictate the kind of motion that you see. Here is a much more elaborate painting, and that's what I have a video of. But whatever I told you about the boxes is true of these houses here. So there's an accordion surface. It has fewer objects. It has only 4, 3, and 2 instead of 5, 4, and 3. But the idea is exactly the same. Not only that, here, this house is very, very much distinguished from that house, whereas the Brillo boxes are confusing sometimes. You don't know where one begins and the other, where one ends and the other begins. And so, this now, we should see these two houses turning in one direction, and those three houses turning in the opposite direction, and those houses turning in the same direction as those two houses. And those two houses which are planar, remember this is a flat surface, should move a little bit less than the other. So let me show you this animation. Oh, I forgot to show you something else. I'm surprised why I cannot. Let me quit PowerPoint. I don't understand why I cannot show you the most interesting of all. Escape? Escape? Perhaps. Thank you. No?
Can you try to do it from the multiple view? You know, if you...
Escape.
I'm sorry?
Escape.
I did hit escape, but...
Try to go to the tile layout.
There we go. I would like to show you simultaneously flat, forced, and reverse perspectives. But this is my trial. And now for each clip, for each video clip that you see, maybe that's why something's wrong. Oh, here, it's going. For each clip that you see, the turntable rotates clockwise as seen from above. So it always turns clockwise. I see that I have a problem with it. Yeah, something is askew. Well, let me show you Patrick's piece. I hope it shows. Maybe I should restart the application. I should restart the application. Just give me a moment. Sorry about that. That was the climax. Some of it will be lost in the edges, but I don't have time to. Okay, so you see.
Can you move the cursor?
Yes. Thank you. Look at this building and that building. One rotates clockwise, as in from above, the other rotates counterclockwise. And of course, the doors open and close, but that's well established by Patrick Hughes decades ago. This is relatively new from 2008. It started from 2008. And by snooping on his website, I've seen 5 such paintings altogether. Do you see that the objects take over the surface? Ideally, if this were unpainted, the entire surface would move coherently. But now the surface is broken up because of the object properties. And if I had the money that Patrick Hughes' art commands, that's the painting I would buy. Okay, and I would like to show you one last thing. I still have time. I would like to show you my attempt to make reverse perspectives, proper perspectives, and flat perspectives, which is, compared to Patrick, amateurish, of course, but nevertheless, it's an attempt. If I can find my cursor. Here it is. So remember, the turntable turns clockwise if you see it from above all the time.
Can you move the cursor again, please?
And look at the, thank you, look at the central figure. As you see here, there's a forced perspective, reverse perspective, and a flat perspective. Look at the central building and see which one is rotating in what direction. If you pay attention to the, there's no question that the reverse perspective moves in the opposite direction than the forced perspective. There's no question about it. The real question is what happens to the middle building, to the middle flat perspective. And you see them one by one. Here is the forced perspective, no problem. It rotates in the physical, it appears to be rotating in the physical direction of rotation because there's no ambiguity, there's no false representation. There's no depth misrepresentation. Here's the flat one. Look at the central building and try to look at it maybe with the hole through your fingers because it appears to be rotating in the opposite direction. It appears to be rotating very, very slightly, especially when it has an oblique view like now, like about now.
Yeah.
It'll appear to be rotating in the opposite direction.
Oh, it's collapsed.
But it's very subtle, and as I said, it has to occupy your entire visual field, and I think then it becomes a lot more forceful. But remember, there is no motion parallax signal here because it's a plane. There is lots of motion parallax signals in the reverse perspective to fool us. And here's the reverse perspective. Remember, this rotates in the clockwise direction, not in the counterclockwise direction. And of course, that's it. That's the solution.
Yeah.
So that's the reverse perspective. And then I would put the flat perspective and the forced perspective one on top of the other so that we can see the contrast between the two. So that's the forced perspective and that's the flat perspective. There's definitely a differential motion between them.
Yeah.
But again, Patrick put them all in the same piece, so you can observe it. I have to segregate them in space. That's the best I could do. So my hats off to Patrick, and let me give you some parting conclusions very briefly, and we're done. This is the end, I believe this is the end of the animation. Yes? So, conclusions. So I hope that I have given you some evidence that what we perceive in the final analysis is partly due to top-down factors, in our case, previous experience and stored knowledge. Secondly, the explanation for the illusory motion of stationary objects is based on extraretinal signals like the three-dimensional mental representation. The illusory motion of objects under self-motion appears to be a consequence of misperceived depth or misperceived depth assignment. Number 4, top-down factors such as a three-dimensional representation could explain a wide range of depth inversion as well as illusory motion phenomena. And finally, the qualitative model, remember the model I showed you is only a qualitative model, but it needs to be refined and expanded into a quantitative model that can also account for the distortions of shape that are observed when someone looks at a mask, and this is the work that is in progress. Thank you very much. Dangerous point. I would like to add very briefly that what Colin said yesterday is also very true. In other words, for a perspective which appears to be like that, but we see it like this, we expect that when we move, we'll see more of one edge, less of the other, but we see the opposite. So that can be another explanation, but the two of them are not necessarily contradictory.
I think they're just different statements of the same geometry.
Yes, I think so too.
May I make a remark? Well, one remark which I've made before is that if you're building in flat perspective of Castoria there were isolated, it would more readily move in the reverse way, just as I said about those yellow crepes on that blue thing.
Right.
And that when I'm looking at this room now, these lines of perspective, like a cat's cradle, do cause it to be there, and that's what you found when you were running in Birmingham, wasn't it? That if it's isolated.
Right. That's a good point.
It's
not anchored.
The distinction between isolation and integration, I say, of the hollow mask illusion is typically isolated, and the perspective illusions are typically integrated, is a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where you could have a fourth image there, just of the building on its own,
indeed,
against a neutral ground. And I think that what you found, that element of reverse movement, would be maybe doubled, to 10%, or 20%.
And we've done experiments and we observed precisely that. I have a slide, but I ran out of time.
That's a strange quality of perspective, that it is an entirely coherent geometrical system, isn't it? It's pinning us all here, whereas the hollow mask illusion is simply and isolated on its own.
I think it's touching the same point. You said something which I'd never thought about before, and I think it's really quite profound, the fact that the interpretation of motion within the retinal image as you move, it provides a source of disambiguation about the absolute distance of objects, or at least the relative distance compared with other objects.
Right.
So if something appears to move as you move, the simplest assumption visual system can make is that you've got wrong the estimate of where it is. So this must be, you could argue this is happening all the time. As part of the algorithm for deciding where things are, you minimize the apparent movement during itself. In that case, if that algorithm was working really efficiently, then reverspectives shouldn't work. Because what the point about reverspective, of course, is that the motion is, unless it's in a movie or something like that, is caused by you,
Right.
which is really weird.
Mhm.
So here's a funny thing that's happening apparently in the world,
Right.
things are only moving when you're moving.
Right.
And you could resolve them instantly
Indeed.
by the correct interpretation of that
Right.
shape. So
Right.
why doesn't that always happen? Why, when you look at one of Patrick's paintings, when you stand still, yes, maybe you get the false impression that perspective dominates, but you'd think that it would be instantly made veridical as soon as you move.
Right, or for that matter, for the mask.
Yeah.
But what I believe is happening is that these are rare instances of stimuli that are so powerful, as well as the Ames window, that are so powerful, they have so much power in them in terms of their interpretation, that it trumps all the bottom-up signals. And indeed, the moment you see something moving, if you know that it doesn't have any battery, it's your mind that moves it, therefore you should be able to recover it immediately. But we don't penetrate cognitively our visual system. So one may say that the people with schizophrenia have an advantage over us because they don't see the illusion. They are more veridical. They have more veridical. But that's only 1 per million of cases. For the other 999,999, they're wrong, or they're not wrong, but they take longer to experience three-dimensional reality because their algorithm doesn't work. They don't apply the kinds of knowledge that we have about bottles, laptops, chairs, bodies, and so on and so forth.
But can I come in on that, because that was the question I wanted to ask, because I find it quite confusing that the schizophrenia results are the way round that they are.
No, it shows that all things with schizophrenia are wrong.
I find that confusing. I know that if you take things in autistic spectrum disorder, they're less susceptible to certain illusions, and that makes sense to me. But in other areas of hallucinations, and I'm doing some work with some clinical psychologists in Newcastle at the moment, looking at people who may or may not experience complex visual hallucinations as a result of a number of things, eye disease sometimes as a result of that, but sometimes in psychotic conditions. The story there would be that the people who experience the complex visual hallucinations have got more kind of top-down stuff going on, not less.
Right.
So I just wondered if you could help resolve that paradox for me, because it doesn't fit with my simple-minded prediction about what we might expect. Chris might know the answer.
Yeah, maybe would you like to offer?
You should all read my new paper.
I should.
But I mean, it's perfectly. There are lots of other. It's not just with these hollow masks and things. I mean, even the self-tickling story is actually them being more veridical. And the jumping to conclusions story about picking balls out of vases, they're reaching their conclusion on too little evidence. So it's again more. They're affected by the evidence and less by the prior expectation. And I entirely agree. This seems to go against things like paranoia.
Yeah.
But you have to remember that we have a hierarchy of these inferences.
Right.
So in fact they are getting what I like to call false prediction errors, which makes them think this the world is different from what it is. But right at the top of this, they have to say, why am I always getting false prediction errors? And that's where the paranoia comes in. But this is complete speculation, but I think it's absolutely fascinating and important, because on cannabis has the same effect.
Yes, indeed. Cannabis, alcohol, lack of sleep, it has the same effect of not seeing the illusion as strongly, not when you're fine, when you're...
But could we have view limits?
I just had you touched very briefly on the apparent difference between the distance people judge things to be at from a quick glance and from a slightly longer viewing. And I just would be grateful for some clarification on if you have a sense of when that shifts and how that works.
All I know is that the experiments that we ran, which were run by Michael Wagner in Israel, he asked observers to fixate for a long time at the LEDs, which we pointed by bright LEDs what they were supposed to fixate, and keep their fixation for a long time. And these are the results that I showed you. But the Vanet and I forget the name of the first author at this moment. But there's a team in the Netherlands that before us, 1 year before us, they found that for fast saccadic eye movements, their vergence angle was dictated by the true geometry. So that's the extent to which I know.
Martin?
Yeah, this is a subjective experiment that might be of interest. I'm fortunate enough to live with one of Patrick Hughes' multiples, which is a case in the corner of a room. It's orthogonal perspective, not fully convergent, but I see it every day as I walk down to my kitchen. And I've experimented with viewing distances and where I can hold on to the actual view of it, if I can call it such, where it's a series of facets and where it switches, and in a range of viewing distances, and by forcing my focus at different levels, there is a point at which in this range of viewing distances, I suspect about 6 to 10 feet, where I can keep the facets and stop it lurching and moving completely. Right. But it's hard work.
Right.
You really have to force it. You have to keep saying, facets, look at them, look at the surface, look at the surface, and then it lurches back to the original one. But it is possible to get yourself to not to pick up the movement.
Do you use eye movements, or do you fixate at a given point?
When you to stop it moving, you need rather precise focus and hold on to it.
Okay.
If you do something like an infinite focus, you're completely lost. So I think what you focus on and how your focus works, your depth of field, as it were, is actually probably a rather crucial factor. I don't know if you've factored that in.
Yes. We have found evidence, but we don't have conclusive results yet. We're still running experiments that if you fixate on a concave part of the reverse perspective, the illusion becomes stronger than if you fixate, for example, on the Historia. If you fixate on the apex of the truncated pyramid, then the illusion becomes weaker. And that goes, this is an agreement with the tendency of humans to see things concave as convex. Because objects, bodies, human-made objects, and rocks, and all those things are convex. Therefore, we have a prior to see things as convex. This is why when you see convex parts of the reverse perspective, you tend to see it as convex, therefore no illusion. Whereas if you look at concave parts of the reverse perspective, you have a tendency to see them as convex, therefore it enhances the illusion. But I don't have definitive data on that yet, and we're running experiments on that.
Really quickly, and in reverse order of the question, can I just address a few things? Firstly, on Shelley's point, as I mentioned yesterday, there is quite a bit of experience work, my own as well as Bruce Bridgman's, that it's not through fast and slow visual systems. As long as you prevent the person becoming, quote, visually conscious of it, you'll continue to be accurate. But if you allow them to become conscious, and Bruce Bridgman's thing with the rule, I suspect my own with by tactile illusions of where the body is, to get the thing. Second on Colin's point, look, ages ago, I worked and published a paper with associative agnotic patients. They don't know what things are, but if in the normal environment, they're okay on a 3D distribution. But if you present them with a colour photograph, absolutely, and you put them in the position of the camera, but you now prevent any movement parallax. Now, if you have, for example, a knife occluded by an apple, if you had the same knife and they could have motion parallax, they didn't know what it was, but they could say, well, there's that, and it's there as well, the blade. But now they think the blade occluded is two separate objects. In other words, because they don't have the object of that. And the very final point is, well, it's not very much, is that not only do I think the stuff actually on schizophrenics go against the simplistic. Almost all of the projected ones, going back to Silvano Arietti on schizophrenia, but actually, of course, it really falsifies Theseus's simplistic notion at the beginning of Act 5 of Midsummer Night's Dream, where he says the madman, the poet, and the lover are all of fantasy compact. I mean, he gives the simplistic version of projection under impoverished visual conditions.
I see.
But your, I think, it absolutely falsifies it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was wondering whether you've done some work on, or maybe I missed it, I don't know if you mentioned it, on color saturation and colors in relation to, because you talk a lot about lines, geometry, angles, So I'm referring it more to a geometric.
Right.
But what about color saturation and color?
In relation to this work,
Yeah.
three-dimensional objects, no, I didn't do it. But can you elaborate a little bit?
Well, I'm wondering whether it plays a part. I don't know.
In the cognitive process?
Yeah, in the cognitive process. I'm just, I'm just wondering, because I found myself, as you were talking, I was playing with the corner of that room.
Right,
and
right.
I was looking at the doors, and I was actually managing, without looking at the cornicing above there, I was managing to get it to come towards me and recede from
Right,
there.
right.
So I did get a
yes.
Patrick Hugh in real life.
Right, I do that all the time.
Yeah, and also the distances. But then as I was looking at the wall and the doors, brown, beige, grey, then I started noticing that there are shadows, there are different lights, there are different saturations of
Right.
color. And then I thought, I wonder how much that, and light.
Right.
obviously, how
Maybe
much-
I have an indirect comment on your question. That is, it may be very plausible that different spatial frequencies play different roles in this illusion, and we're planning to do that. But we need, in order to do that, we need to bring this on a virtual world.
Yeah, I mean, we know that.
So in that sense, color being relatively low pass signal might make a difference.
Yeah.
But it may not be the color itself, it may
No.
be the spatial frequency.
Yeah,
of the-
yeah, and
of
you
the-
see that just behind you there is a darker wall,
Yes.
which also happens to be a real receding wall. It's really behind
Right.
that lighter wall where the screen is.
Right.
But in fact, even if they were at the same level, that one on the left would still look like it's receding.
Right.
Just in relation to that.
Thank you. Yes.
There is an illusion, I don't know where of it, that if you use Naples yellow lines to create a perspective picture, rather like this Naples yellow here, and this might be this effect, you can get the perspective to pop forward like a pyramid. It actually reverses.
Right.
Sometimes down the street I walk down and hit these yellow lines in some scaffolding. They're not quite white yellow, but suddenly will pop the other way. And if Naples yellow against black will actually pop
And it's
reverse.
particular to that
It's
color?
particular to those colours.
I'm not
It's
aware of
used by Sebastiano di Piombo in a
I see.
picture in Kingston Lacey.
I see.
And he makes it, if you take up figures, it flips the wrong way, and then the colours of the figures flip it back the other way. So there's a tension between it, and the reason is because I suspect that it's to those lines, in line orientation in V1, there are black on white lines, which you can preferentially paint cadmium red, or you can do white on black lines, which you feel artistic. You want to paint Naples yellow on a black background.
I see.
And normally, perspective is, I suspect, is being calculated by these black on white lines. And then if you do them the wrong colour, there's an output, rather like on a dashboard of your car, to other brain areas. And when you do it the wrong way around, the full or the empty side on your dashboard is messed up. So you actually get this reverse effect.
Right, that's an interesting issue, but perhaps one can defeat the reverspective by using black, that color, yellow color on black.
And another way, one more thing is that if you, one way of showing this is outside the tape there was a large spider by Louis Bourgeois. And she had this giant spider.
Right.
And the fun thing was, if you look, line orientation is pushed out, if you like, of animal recognition, and it's accentuated around the outside of it. So, and the fun thing is, if you look at the perspective of the bridge through the legs of the sculpture, the perspective is destroyed because line orientation is switched off.
Right.
So, and line orientation is calculated perspective. So you actually get a complete flattening of all the perspective, and then you look to the side, it's actually louder.
I'd like to see your
So it's quite fun.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, I was looking at all these, marvelously magical objects that have been produced with this playing with perception. But the one thing I was looking at was the actual subjects, which are some of the Italian streets in the main that we've seen. And it seemed to me a demonstration of a wonderful tool, but the subject matter was rather anodyne, sort of chocolate boxy in its way. And I wondered how one could develop this in the future for more dramatic or powerful statements about the world, rather than just demonstrating perspective objects. I mean, what would you use it for?
What you would use it for?
In a more dramatic, expressionist way.
I have not given it much thought, but this is a very interesting.
It could be used in theatre, it could be used in all sorts of things, in more dramatic.
Oh, by the way, I've seen it in Venice, in a Gucci store. I've seen a reverse perspective. I told Patrick about this 10 years ago. So advertisement is one thing.
Yeah, I'm a bit on, on this same sort of path that you, because this is a question of aim. With which aim do you perceive? In my experience, you perceive until you have understood. And the question of understanding or sense-making is a question of your aim. So once you have understood it, the cognitive process doesn't continue, it stops. And I think when you look at it like we have done now, it is like this is a very sort of, how should I say, non-human way of looking at it, because the subject is absent. And so that's why I'm a little bit in the same path as you, because it's like we're all the same, and we've all had the same sort of cognitive capacity, but we haven't the same cognitive capacity. So I would like to sort of introduce the human, the viewer, into this discussion.
But the viewer is, I disagree with you strongly. The viewer is a very integral part of this. In fact, it is because the viewer moves that they see.
But the viewer has an aim.
Emotion. In fact, I don't know of any experiments. Maybe Vicky or someone else knows. In fact, we were planning to do such experiments, but there's so much we can do. So the question is, if you put this on your periphery, will you still see the illusion? In other words, do you need engagement in order to see the illusion? I'm not sure if it's automatic. So I think
how long does the viewer move? Only until the point where they are satisfied and they have made sense of that.
In other words, they discover the illusion and then they lose interest, you think?
Yes.
Oh no. I've been fascinated with this for 10, 15 years. And I'm still not saturated because I can always find new ideas.
But you are a scientist. That's completely different.
It's not only from the point of view of science. I think, for example, one idea is to leave some panels blank. Because the idea came to me just recently. Leave some panels blank, just like a sculpture, and paint the rest of them, and see what happens to the blank panel.
I'm a researcher within the design field, and I think some of the most sort of failures when it comes to design is just the assumption that our cognitive capacity is sort of very much the same, and that we do perceive objects in the same way. We don't. We stop when the usability is fulfilled. And we don't want to know anything more. Then we make a decision, and this says this object is for me, or it's not for me, or I don't understand it, so I don't want to
I agree with you partially, because I've also met people, and of course Patrick must have a lot more experience than I do, but I've shown this to maybe 525 or so people, maybe more, I don't know, I have not counted them. But I have found people fall into categories. Some of them come in the lab, couldn't care less, they do the experiment, they leave. Others come in and they say, I would like to have this. Where do I get it? And there are others that are fascinated, and they're not scientists. They are artists. Some of them are artists. And I don't think
But you can't generalize. That's exactly what I mean.
Exactly. And also the distance at which the illusion breaks down is totally personal. I mean, very, very
That is the answer.
Across, yes. So indeed, I'm not suggesting that we all do these things in the same way. Definitely not. There's a lot of variation, and that's what makes us humans, after all, because we're not all the same.
I'll take two more questions, and then we can have lunch, Martin.
Yeah, well, I hope it might be more than two, because I'm hoping to ask a question or answer a question so badly that Patrick will intervene and give us the correct answer. And it's a question about the content of them. And people tend not to think about the content of them, but if you look at his oeuvre as a whole, including the pre-reverse perspective ones, it is operating in a surrealist area, broadly speaking, and the parallels I would make are with Magritte, with De Chirico, and they're very extraordinary interior and exterior environments, devoid of people but extraordinarily evocative of human presences, and there are all sorts of funny, surreal things going on there. So if we treat them just as illusions, then I think we miss something. They do have a strange, eerie content, but I'm hoping that Patrick will say this is either right or wrong.
Well, one of my answers is that in my early work I used to tell people things. If a rainbow came into prison, it would go grey. If you look in the car window, out the car window, you see the future and the past in one. And now I think you experience, I like to think that I would give people, when you see the thing, that disconcerting experience of what on earth is happening in the world. Magritte was, in his painting, was saying, what on earth is happening in the world, I think. And I like to think that, as 50%, as Duchamp said, 50% of the artwork is created by the seer, or the SER, the seer. And I like to think that's just a, if you like, abstract experience of a paradoxical reality. I suppose I think it is a paradoxical reality to be sitting here and being so highly praised and so on, and talking about me. And I'm uniquely uninterested in me, funnily enough. I've never had any interest in myself, but I am interested in this other world. And I like to think that we get an experience, and an abstract experience, rather than saying a thing.
Right, okay.
Well, I would like to ask Patrick a question. How did he come up with this idea of breaking the surfaces into objects, and how did you come up with this idea? It's fascinating.
What, the new idea?
Yeah.
To have the three?
To have all three on the
Yeah, it is a good idea, isn't it? Yeah. It's very hard to come up with good ideas. That was 5 years ago. I don't think I have had an idea. There's this famous story about meetings like this between artists and scientists, and a surrealist poet named Einstein. He said, do you know, Einstein, what I do when I have an idea, the butterfly fell into the bucket, I write it down here, or my nose is an anvil. What do you do? And Einstein said, well, I haven't had an idea for 30 years. I haven't had one for 5.
I think we probably...
Can I just ask one question? Ask one question. The illusions of Patrick's stuff is cancelled by when you get near.
Yes.
Now, what I want to happen is that all has to do with a change of visual knowledge at one particular point. Suddenly, you receive information which says that you've been wrong about what you've seen when you walked around. What happens if you have, if you acquaint yourself with the forward presentation of those figures by a tactile clue? In other words, what happens if you have a large stick which actually makes contact with what actually turns out to be a protruding thing rather than a receding thing? In other words, does the tactile cancel the visual?
I have an answer. I've met 2 observers in my 525, as many as they are, who come up all the way to this building. I tell them, touch it now, and they go like that. But of course, the physical reality is like that. So if they touch it like that, I say, with my eyes, I see it like that, and with my hands, I see it like that. So they have a complete dissociation, 2 of them. And they have perfect stereopsis. It's not that they're stereo blind, because if they were stereo blind, I could understand it. I tested them with random dot stereograms, and they have perfect stereopsis. So I cannot explain that.
They don't interact.
They don't interact, right.
But what does happen when someone with a walking stick or something is a long distance from where, in fact,
that's an interesting experiment.
I mean, it's that thing that William James talks about the fact that you feel your walking stick, not in the palm of your hand, you feel it in the tip of the walking stick. And what I want to know is what happens when the tip of the walking stick is covering something which you thought was receding and turns out to be protruding.
I think we could try. Well into enough time.
Well, it would be interesting to see it.
So I think we'd better stop, but thank you, that was very...